The reason this conversation exists at all is because, as I said at the very beginning, when I've heard Clint play trombone, which is a joyous experience, and his son Riley Baker is picking up some of that wonderful greasy nastiness in his playing, I've always complimented him on sounding like Sandy Williams. And Williams is one of the people who never gets talked about. Clint just told me that Williams lived a long time, 1906 to 1991, and he stopped playing in 1951 or so. And his career on records, I think, starts in 1932 with Henderson, and it ends with some air shots from Dr. Jazz from the Stuyvesant Casino. And one more sentence, Williams was an alcoholic, and that did not, I think that's what ended his playing career early, but that is not the point of what we're talking about. What attracted me was a kind of exuberant, huge sound, and something that if you didn't know any better, you would think of as undisciplined, but is really very highly disciplined playing.
His playing was very disciplined. I came across Sandy Williams through the door of Bunk Johnson, because in my early years, I was my main thrust was New Orleans jazz and trying to get to the heart of the matter through Oliver and Jelro Morton and Bechet and Bunk Johnson. My whole thrust of my life in the early days was to get back to the earliest stuff as I could. And one of the miracles of early Blue Note records is Bunk Johnson and Bechet recording. And as much as I, to this day, can't have a hard time even contemplating Bechet's clarinet playing on those recordings, because his clarinet playing is so spot on. And now you know why in 1918 he set the world on fire with the Southern Syncopated Orchestra with Will Marion Cook, because his clarinet playing, I mean, if he'd never picked up the soprano saxophone, he'd still be just as well known. But the soprano, he gets a bad rap because he spent so much time playing the soprano. But that alone, and Bunk Johnson's playing, Bunk was not always the most with it on recordings. He had an alcohol problem himself, and he was an older gentleman who had dentures, so he had trouble with his chops. To hear Bechet and Bunk play so well together was mind-boggling to me, and particularly since they didn't like each other very much. It's even more astonishing that they produced such beautiful New Orleans ensemble music. But they were joined by Sandy Williams, and I didn't know much about Sandy Williams when I heard those first recordings, but I was intrigued. And at that point, I started the panorama of Sandy Williams opened up to me. And the thing that Sandy Williams has that's so important in jazz, that is not always valued as much as it could be, and or is just paid lip service to, is the sound of surprise. You never know what he's going to play. He plays the breaks he plays alone, the breaks he plays on some of the early, some of those Ella Fitzgerald recordings are astonishing. But he did crazy things. He had the vocabulary of all of this whole series of this conversation that Michael and I are having about the New York style. He basically encompasses all of it and takes it to a whole nother level of surprise and delight, because I thought the whole point of jazz was that we're supposed to be delighted by the surprise and the sound. He had a tone that was changeable, a very versatile sound, where he could play kind of with a delicate timbre, but he could also really pour it on like the old guys like Charlie Green and Jimmy Harrison. He was probably the best exponent of that style. I think about his blues playing on some of those Bechet and Bunk things, like I think it's on Sandy's Flat.
Up in Sydney's Flat.
Sydney's Flat. That record was mind blowing to me. His his concept of how to play the blues and the trombone, his growl. The thing about it, I still can't figure out how he gets kind of this very low level. It doesn't draw your attention to it, but he has a rasp to his sound that's completely planned. He's making growling noises in his throat to make that sound, to get that kind of edge, a growling edge to his sound, which is nobody did that. He's completely unique, and you hear it also in his solo work with Chick Webb's band. I can't tell you how many times I'll be in the car listening to the Chick Webb records, and I'm just always thrilled to hear Sandy Williams' solos because they're always hot. He just encompasses all of the stuff of the New York trombone style. He's sort of like the living end of that style, because when you hear him play, you hear a little bit of the Charlie Green. You hear the way he can play kind of hot and kind of execute, and you hear a lot of the Jimmy Harrison stuff, and then you hear just the beautiful freak factor that is Sandy Williams in his playing. And I don't know. I could talk about. Once again, there's a rush of solos and breaks I hear in my head that come flood to mind. Do you have any? What are your favorite Sandy Williams records, Michael?
I think my answer is every damn one of them. But what sticks in my mind is the band that Bechet brought into Victor in 1940. Sidney DeParis, Sandy Williams, Bechet.
Yeah.
Cliff Jackson, I think
so, yeah.
Bernard Addison, maybe Ernest Myers, I could be wrong on this, and Sid Catlett. And that band, I don't have the ears to hear Sandy Williams in the Webb ensemble, but when he explodes out of it into a solo, he's extravagantly beautiful. But in a three-person front line,
well, that gets us back to the whole going back to the first part of this conversation, which was Charlie Irvis, is that these guys they weren't coming from a New Orleans perspective, so the kind of parts they play in those three-part ensembles is different than what Ori or somebody else might have played. I don't know. I almost think about Sandy Williams and Teagarden as being kind of the two ends of the trombone spectrum. You know, Teagarden, by the time he was with Armstrong and had big band, he had a lot of years of playing commercial band situations, and Teagarden had become very smooth, almost like a brand. Does that make sense? I mean, and I don't want that to sound like I'm insulting him. I mean, it was a little bit like Tommy Dorsey had in a way, I think Tommy Dorsey really did have a brand. Tommy Dorsey lived his whole life, the whole second half of his somewhat short life being envious of Jack Teagarden because Jack Teagarden could play what he wanted to play. But the truth is I don't think that I think Jack kept his playing with the idea that he had an image or a brand to keep up. Sandy Williams was on the opposite end of that spectrum. I think part of it was because he was African American, and he was never going to be a big superstar. So his playing always has the sound of surprise in there. You never know what he's going to do. You can't predict it. And even if you've heard the record 50 times, like what's that break he plays on? But I like there's one break he plays on Dipsy Doodle, which I hate that song with a deep abiding passion. But wee wah wah. And his playing. We were talking about Higginbotham earlier, constructing these beautiful lines and breaks. Well, he was always just going straight for the freak factor. But wee wah wah. And it's like, who thinks of that? And this is on a record that was a commercial record. I mean, I think Chick Webb really wanted to have commercial success, and with Ella, he knew he could have it. But then he's got the freak factor in there with Sandy Williams playing.
And just to digress, Sandy Williams is playing next to Taft Jordan,
yes,
who is his own version of Lewis.
Yes,
but he's the most free soloist of those Chick Webb decas.
Well, no
And
question about
he
it.
gets space, and obviously there was something about him that Chick loved because he's featured on many, many of those records.
Yeah, and they're beautiful solos too.
Yeah.
You know, his play. Yeah, it's clearly that Chick probably really enjoyed his sound and his ability, his ideas. His ideas are amazing. It is always, and he just encompasses that whole style of everything we've been talking about. You know, the Charlie Green, the Irvis. I'm not sure who his influences were. Because like Michael, we were talking before the camera started about nobody interviewed a lot of these guys, so we don't know what they were thinking about. I figure that, you know, those of us who play jazz, the people we heard early on loom large in our minds. When I listen to Sandy Williams, I definitely hear a lot of Charlie Green, a lot of Charlie Green in there. And I think that might have been one of his big influences. But he took it to a whole nother level of avant-garde craziness. You know, I know, you know, there's so much goodness in just the idea that he was free to do what he wanted to do, that the band leaders helped, like Chick let him do it, or like Bunk, even on those Bunk records, he's always himself. So not only does he have the sound of surprise, it's also completely his own unique take on playing the trombone. I don't know, I could just go on, you know.
Well, we will save that for another series of interviews. I will just say that talking with Clint Baker about trombonists has not at all been a surprise for me, because I know he not only plays it, but he has studied it and he lives it. But I will loop around and say it has been a delight. So I thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you so much.